This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. With all the urgent issues this country faces, who would have thought that the cost of higher education and mounting student debt would be getting so much traction in the presidential race? But that topic is one of the driving forces behind the early success of Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Both Democrats advocate for free public college tuition funded with new taxes, and both favor different flavors of college debt forgiveness. If you think the idea of free college tuition is out there, then you aren't among the 60% of voters who are on board with the idea. But even among the 60%, along with many Democrats, are skeptical. Many of them are skeptical about making that a reality. If you go back just a few years, the prospect of a college education at a public university or college was not coupled with crippling debt. So why has the cost of college become so high? And what can be done? What can government do to bring those costs down? We spend the hour exploring those questions and more with Colleen Campbell. She's Director for Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress. She joins us via Skype from Washington. Good morning. Welcome.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm great. And in our Spirit Square studio is Chris Marsicano, Visiting Assistant Professor of Educational Studies at Davidson College. Welcome to you. Good morning.
Well, thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'll dispel you of that. If you join our conversation, you can do so through email at charlottetalks@wfae.org. Search for WFAE on Facebook. Get to us through Twitter at Charlotte Talks. So, Chris, there is no such thing, we are told, as a free lunch. Is there any such thing as a free college education, really?
Sort of. So the short answer is sort of. Free college, as we talk about it, tends to mean free at the point of delivery, free to the student attending college. That doesn't mean that it's not paid for in some way. Most of the free college programs in the country that are done at the community college level, at the state level, are paid for by the state general fund or state taxes. Tennessee probably has the most innovative free community college program called Tennessee Promise, and it's paid for through a lottery fund. So there are sources of money paying for this.
Doesn't Georgia have a similar program?
Georgia has a program called HOPE, which funds sort of needy merit-based students that pays a portion of a four-year degree at a Georgia public institution.
You know, I went to a public institute. I went to the University of Maryland. It was although I was an out-of-state student, so I paid more than in-state students did there. I had college loan debt when I got out, but I don't think I considered it onerous. I thought, gee, that's a lot of money, but then I was 18 years old. But I didn't consider it onerous. Today, a lot of kids are leaving school with debt that they won't pay off till well into middle age. I don't know whether that includes, Colleen, the cost of college in a public institution. But when did this begin to rise to that extent? It cost that much money, and what is driving those costs?
Sure. So we've seen increases in college costs really since the 90s. They have kind of taken off. And in particular, during the recession, we saw huge increases in enrollment, which typically happens during recessions, but also during that time, increases in the amount of debt that folks were taking on. And so it happens at not just the undergraduate level, but at the graduate level as well. And that's really where you're seeing those people with, $100,000, $150,000 debt balances. Those are really graduate students.
When you think of the rising cost of college, you want to blame profligate spending on the parts of schools and building all these gymnasiums and other things, big brick buildings, and maybe paying their coaches and their administration a lot of money that they probably don't have to spend, or you think that they don't have to spend. How much of it has to do with, when it comes to public colleges, how much of the increase has to do with how state legislators have decided to fund these public universities as opposed to how they were funded in the 1960s?
I would say a huge amount. I mean, during the recession, states by and large chose pensions over public universities and defunded public universities, leading those universities to push tuition onto students. But it's not just state legislatures. There are some things as part of the cost of college that are going to be static no matter whether it's a private school or a public school or a for-profit school, the cost of labor, the cost of the fact that service industry services as opposed to goods don't cut costs as quickly as goods being sold. So you can reduce the price of a TV over time, reduce the cost of making a TV over time, but it's really hard to reduce the price of making a college graduate. It's really hard to reduce the price of teaching 30 students in a classroom.
Well, are costs today in line when you figure in inflation? Are they in line with what they were in the 60s, 70s?
The cost of a university education has increased past inflation.
Why?
Inflation is tied again in part to those goods, right? So the cost of educating professors.
I mean, where's that money going? Is it going to?
Well, so there's a few other aspects of this. So one is that we have, I think when people think about college, they think about kind of traditional grassy four-year university campus. But really what college looks like for most students is going to an open access four-year public college or a community college. And so when you have the students that are enrolling in those institutions, typically they need a lot more wraparound services than students who might be going to a much more selective residential college. And so you'll end up seeing, trying to help students access public benefits programs, providing childcare or other supports for students who are parents. Doing all different types of counseling to ensure that students are getting through not just their first semester and first year, but through their education as a whole. And so those wraparound services cost a lot, but we also have seen that in higher education, state legislatures treat colleges as kind of the balance wheel, is what we call it in our wonk language, which is essentially states will be funding healthcare, K-12 education, a variety of other things. And so they use the higher education budget to essentially balance their books. And so what ends up happening is any leftover money goes to higher education, and increasingly that leftover money has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller.
So that's a factor, but then do you also have to factor in, when you talk about the relative cost of college today and the relative amount of student loan debt being accumulated by students who go to 4 years of college and beyond, do you have to also figure in the fact that wages have stagnated over that same period of time, and so that makes it even more expensive because you're not making as much when you get out. You're not making the equivalent of what you would have made with a college degree 30 years ago. Do you have to figure that in? Yes, you do.
Yes, absolutely. And that has a factor with student loan debt repayment, right? So if you think about what we've seen historically, not just in wage stagnation over the last decade or so, but also with labor market discrimination, wage discrimination. We have all of these statistics that show that women and people of color make less than white men. And so those factors layered on top of student loan debt and student loan monthly payments mean that those people tend to struggle more in repaying their loans.
So, Chris, they say that the amount of college loan debt in the collective is $1.5 trillion.
Yeah, it's a big number.
Put that number into perspective. How does that compare to what normal student debt might, and that normal consumer debt might be?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that while the total debt amount is around $1.5 trillion, the average amount borrowed by a student going to a four-year university is around $27,000.
That doesn't seem onerous.
This is one of the...
What's the interest rate?
It depends on what kind of loans students take out. But whether they take out private loans or public loans, there are different kinds of public loans. In general, and I would love to hear what Colleen thinks about this as well, but in general, if students take out primarily Stafford loans, subsidized and unsubsidized, which are federal loans with a pretty competitive interest rate, they are not going to graduate with a mountain of debt. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct.
Colleen? Yeah. So
I think so. And I would just say that the maximum amount that a dependent undergraduate student can borrow, so that's a student, between the ages of 18 and 24, supported by their parents, they can only borrow $31,000. So I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind.
So the rest is on the backs of the parents if it goes beyond that?
There is a loan called a Parent Plus loan that you can borrow, that your parents can borrow if you are a dependent student, and then graduate students can also consider.
And even the $31,000 that an 18 to 24-year-old can borrow, that loan has to be co-signed by the parents. They're on the hook anyway, aren't they? Or not?
They are
They are
They're
not.
So
Yeah.
we make unsecured loans to undergraduate students.
Okay.
The thing with that is the federal government has extraordinary collections mechanisms available to it, so we really don't need underwriting for our federal loans. Unlike private lenders, the federal government can go in and they can sue your employer to garnish your wages, and they can take your tax refunds if you're not repaying your debt. And so even though we don't have what we typically refer to as underwriting in federal student loans, we lend to everyone because we consider loans to be an access tool. We really have very strong ways of getting our money back.
And we also lend to everyone regardless of where they're going to college. As long as it is an accredited institution, students can receive student loans, whether that institution is like, say, the University of North Carolina with a 91% graduation rate, or the University of Phoenix at Charlotte with a 9% graduation
Why do we do
rate.
that? That seems like a waste of federal money. Well, if you know the graduation rate for an institution is really, really low, and 9% is embarrassingly low, why would you lend money to a student to go to that school? Why?
I think there are two major factors. One, we're really focused on access in our federal policy for loans. We have trended, in my
But
opinion.
access to a loser is, I mean, to use the president's favorite word, does that make sense?
To be fair, not everyone can go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill or the University of Maryland or Davidson College. These are not open access institutions like the ones that Colleen was speaking about earlier. It is important to note that this has allowed a broadening access of people to college, and we generally think that that's a good thing. Some college is better than no college. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're setting up students to succeed in that college setting. We have tried some consumer protection programs, so you can go onto the college scorecard and see the graduation rate and the amount of salary that students who took on loans or took on federal grant aid graduated with and got immediately after graduation after a 6-year period. But I don't know to what extent students are actually viewing that and using that to make their choices.
So there is $1.5 trillion in student loan debt hanging out there. 456 million people carry that debt, which is equal to the population of Spain or Argentina. I don't know if that's a lot or not when you consider our population. And the average amount that everybody is carrying is about, what, $26,000. So, Colleen, how does that compare to 20 or 30 years ago?
So debt balances have absolutely grown over 20 or 30 years ago, but I think one of the things we have to consider is that a lot more people are getting a college education. Like Chris mentioned, it's an access tool, and so instead of, unfortunately, our Congress has chosen not to invest in students via grant aid, and so we've left students to rely on student loan debt. But I will mention that what we're seeing really is that the bulk of those outstanding loans are owed by graduate students who have unlimited loan limits, and they are and parents. So basically, those two categories of people are able to borrow absolutely as much as they want within some reason on an annual basis, but it's really not being borne by undergraduate borrowers.
So when we come back from the break, let's talk about that. Is it worth it? If you're accumulating all this debt that you will not pay off until late middle age, if you're lucky, is it worth it? What does it get you? We'll talk about that when we come back. Colleen Campbell is here. She's the Director of Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress. And Chris Marsicano, a visiting Assistant Professor of Education Studies at Davidson College. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Corkscrew Wine Shop and Bar, located at The View in Uptown Charlotte, Brookdale Village in Lake Norman, and Kingsley Village Town Center in Fort Mill. With wine and beer from all over the world, relax, uncork, unwine. CorkscrewWinepub.com. And Liberty Senior Living, presenting the Barclay at South Park, dedicated to a whole-person wellness approach to community living with private apartments, chef-prepared meals, and a maintenance-free lifestyle. Details at barclayatsouthpark.com. From bank mergers to CEO searches and the rise of fintech, it's been a busy summer for banking in Charlotte, and we're going to bring you up to speed tomorrow on the latest in the BB&T SunTrust merger, including some criticism at a congressional hearing last week. We check on earnings at Wells Fargo and Bank of America, and on rumors of BofA's Kathy Bessant being considered for the CEO position at Wells. Eric Spanberg will be here to take you through that tomorrow on this program at 9.
The resignation of Puerto Rico's governor is cheered by hundreds of thousands who wanted to see him gone. Now comes the hard part. Who will take over? And can those in power win back the trust of the people? Puerto Rico's rough road ahead. That's next time on 1A.
That conversation coming up at 10 following Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about the cost of college education, why it's going up, the fact that the Democratic presidential candidates at least, are talking about free college tuition, undergraduate college tuition, and about student loan forgiveness, which we'll get into in a little while, because you're going to be surprised by some of the opinions you're about to hear about both of those ideas. Colleen Campbell is here, Director of Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress, and Chris Marsicano, a visiting assistant professor of education studies at Davidson College. So the average amount of student debt is $26,000. The real debt is being accumulated by people who attend bachelor degree education, graduate students. And they sometimes can mount up. Those costs can mount up. Another presidential candidate, Pete Buttigieg, and his partner have $140,000 collectively in student debt from Harvard and Oxford. I don't know what the mayor's job pays in South Bend, Indiana, but I'll bet you it is not enough to pay that off. So I'm wondering if at some point you have to ask yourself, is it worth it to accumulate all of this? There are already discussions about whether college, undergraduate degrees are worth it, and we'll talk about why they are, but is it worth it? Can you make that money back?
Sure. So I want to be unequivocal when I say this. College is worth it. It is 100% worth it. If you go to college and graduate, you are predicted to make $1 million more over your lifetime than if you don't go to college. So if you can afford it, and you can find a way to do it, go to college. So let's be unequivocal about that. Okay. With respect to graduate degrees, I think it's actually generally a pretty good idea to take out a large amount of loans in certain cases. Let's think of the example of a medical doctor. If you cannot afford to go to medical school, and so therefore you take out $100,000 of loans to go through medical school, by the time you graduate, go through your residency, any internships, and are actually practicing medicine, you will be making in excess of $100,000 a year and be able to pay back those loans. It's also good for society. We get an extra doctor out of it, right? And so that's a really good thing. Having somebody who can help save lives, and the loans making that possible, is a very good thing. I think people don't necessarily think of student loans as an investment, but it's pretty cool that our federal government says, hey, we believe in you. We're going to invest in you because you're going to help society later.
If you incur $26,000, which is the average student loan
for four-year
undergraduate degree, and you end up making $1 million more than somebody who only has a high school diploma, that's a damn good investment.
It's a pretty good deal.
Yeah, but then you start accumulating big bucks, and yes, you become a doctor or you become a lawyer, and perhaps your earning potential is such that you will be able to comfortably pay off the $100,000 that you've accumulated in student debt. Should that loan be forgiven, Colleen? I mean, if we go to this, if one of these candidates get elected president and are able to push this idea through Congress, that would be like Atlas carrying the world. But if we were to move toward that, should we be forgiving loans like that, where clearly you have the money to pay it off?
Sure. I think that one of the important pieces of context that we need to introduce to the conversation is the repayment options that are available to people now, and as well as the forgiveness options that are available. So we have long had programs that offer forgiveness for folks who teach in high need areas, who are in public service jobs, and those programs have expanded over the last 10 years or so. And so forgiving the debt of borrowers is not necessarily a new concept, but I think the scale of the conversation has grown just over the last year or so. And I think that one of the things that we need to consider, and it tends to be where folks get caught up on these plans, is how much money is too much to forgive in the first place, so the balance of the loan, but also should we be forgiving the debt of folks who are making well into six figures?
And no one forces you to go to Harvard or Yale or Oxford or you name it. No one forces you to do that. That's a decision you made.
Sure, especially at the graduate level, I think we have to separate the undergraduate and graduate levels from these things, but also understanding that those six-figure student loan balances don't just come from the Harvards and Yales of the world that really pay off, but they also come from, for-profit colleges have graduate programs. My Uber driver, when I was in Missouri a couple weeks ago, had over $100,000 in debt from a for-profit college graduate program. And so I think we have to consider, too, that we don't have great gatekeeping mechanisms in post-secondary education, and we tend to very rarely kick schools out of the federal aid programs. And so that introduces an element of complexity to this conversation where people have been made promises that have not been fulfilled, and really are not bearing the fruits of the education that their debts are supposed to have purchased.
Is another real problem. It's not just the people who graduate from a four-year school with $26,000 in average debt, or from a graduate school with even more debt. It's the people who incur the debt to get the education but then don't complete the course of study and do not get a diploma. They still owe the money.
Exactly.
How many people fall into that category?
There are about 9 million borrowers who are currently in default. It's a pretty large number, and about 1 million people default every single year. The consequences of default are terrible. It's a hit on your credit that stays for about 7 years, and you're unable to receive any federal financial aid to re-enroll in school. And so that really can hurt people by not allowing them to re-enroll, get the credential that they need in order to make more to pay off the loan. So they're kind of stuck in this cycle of poverty and debt where they just can't get out of it.
So in reading some of the things that you've written about this, Chris, it seems to me that buying a college education is not unlike buying a car. You don't pay...
Except that your college education appreciates over time.
That's right, exactly. The car is a depreciating access, and that's a whole nother show. But you don't pay the sticker price, if you're smart, on a car. And you say that most students who go to college don't pay the full freight.
Yeah, so this is a great time to talk about two different concepts in higher ed pricing. So there's the sticker price, and then there's what we call the net price, which is the price that a student pays less aid, whether it's grant aid or loan aid. It's the price that students actually pay for their college education year over year. So at most of these places, actually, I wanted to bring this up when you're bringing up Harvard and Oxford. Places like Harvard, Stanford, even Davidson have really strong financial aid programs, so that students who have substantial need may actually pay less to go to those schools than they would pay to go to Chapel Hill or the University of Maryland College Park or where have you. So these financial aid programs, Davidson's is called the Davidson Trust, tend to also have the lack of loans packaged in part of their program. So they try to fill your need with entirely grant aid. So it can be a really, really good deal to go to one of these more expensive places if you have a sufficiently low income.
As I was reading through all this material this weekend, I mentioned before we started that this whole, it is so Byzantine that it reminds me of the conversations we had 10 or 11, 12 years ago about health care and about proposals for health care that had yet to be passed by Congress or even submitted by President Obama at the time, because it's just so complex. And we know that other countries in the world make it much easier on people to get and pay for health care. Do we make this more complicated than other countries? Yes, you can go to Davidson for less than the full price, but you have to do a lot of work to figure out where you can get money from this person or that organization, how much student loan you want to debt you want to incur. Do we make it more difficult, Colleen, than most countries do?
We absolutely do.
Why?
And there are, that's a great question. There are certain aspects of the system that exist in other countries, certain things like price capping. Lots of other countries will say this is how much you can borrow, but then they'll also tell colleges this is how much you can charge, and they're tied together. Mm-hmm. We don't do that here, and that's just considered to be almost a taboo topic. Like, we will never do price caps in higher education in the United States, and so that is an aspect of it. But I also think that when we're comparing other nations to the U.S., there are two big things that we need to consider. One is that the U.S. is much larger, and our system is designed for everyone. So if you have a high school diploma, you can go to a college. You can enroll in higher education. That's not the case in other nations. They start to track students much earlier in their lives. And then two is that these other countries have much more intensive social safety net programs available to their residents. And as part of that, that means that we don't have to spend as much money on things like housing and healthcare and all of the other aspects that add costs on top of tuition when you're enrolled in college.
I think it's also important to note that other countries have different repayment mechanisms as well for loans. Student loans are not a uniquely American thing. In Australia, rather than pay your monthly amount to a loan servicer, you pay in your taxes annually. So there are ways that we could simplify that process.
Yeah, and we have a lot of government loans here, but we also have a lot of private loans to fund college educations, and that's a whole different animal.
Very much so.
So I began the show with a question to you, Chris, that began with the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch. But we are also told by another old song that the best things in life are free. And to hear you talk about college and being able to leave with the potential of earning $1 million more than somebody with only a high school diploma, that seems like one of the best things in life. Maybe it should be free. And that's where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and some other Democrats come into this conversation. Both of them support free college and debt forgiveness with different variations of how they would get to those places, and we'll get to those differences. But are either of these plans, or any of the plans supported by some Democrats, feasible?
I don't see a universe in which Mitch McConnell allows a free college
Take
bill.
him out of the equation. Let's say the Democrats gain the Senate. Is it feasible? What's it going to cost us? Colleen, do you know? Because I think I've stumped the panel here.
Sure. So when we look at kind of free college programs, the Center for American Progress has a debt-free college proposal that costs about $60 billion in addition to what we're already spending on higher education every year. There's also another plan that's in the Senate right now where it costs about $80 billion a year. And so they typically tend to be around that level.
Do any of
the
the plans set forth by candidates, does your plan at the Center for American Progress include a mandate to colleges and universities, at least public colleges and universities, to do something to lower costs or to keep costs in check?
Some of them do. Our plan at the Center for American Progress requires institutions to basically make an affordability promise to students, and that's based on the student's income. So the state and the institution have to kick in a certain share of the grant funding in order to access the federal aid that's available in the system. So that acts as kind of a price control.
And Senator Sanders' plan very much so has some price controls in it, or attempted price controls in it.
3 in 5 Americans, including 7 in 10 political independents, support guaranteed free tuition to 2- and 4-year colleges. Does that translate to the political will to make that happen, either at the federal or the state level or both? In other words, given that level of support, should Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, or somebody else who supports this become president, would they have the political capital to make this happen?
So I think that political capital is one question, but just spending is another. And so I think it really depends on what they end up settling on for the funding mechanism for these things, as well as what the appetite is for other programs. So, when we think about a presidential campaign, especially folks that focus on one area, we like to isolate it and talk about higher ed because we do higher ed. But there are also healthcare proposals, there are child care proposals. And so thinking about, a huge funding package, there's a element of picking and choosing that has to happen over time. And so I think it's an open question as to whether higher education gets included at the full amount that these proposals are being talked about right now.
If you give away college education to public universities, if you guarantee that to people, what does that do to taxes? Somebody has to pay for it, either through your state or your federal taxes or a combination of both. If you do that and you forgive the $1.5 trillion of outstanding student loan debt, what does that do to taxes? Well, how much more am I going to pay?
I think that based on proposals from Senator Warren and Senator Sanders, I'm hazarding a guess that you're not ultra wealthy, but you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, yes, I work in public radio.
And so who's going to bear the burden of those taxes are the ultra wealthy in those plans. But I do think, Senator Sanders has talked about taxes going up across the board. I think that this is a very complicated question. It really comes down to what's the political will of increasing taxes on very, very rich people as to how much the middle class will end up.
And when we're talking about very, very rich people here, we're talking about people who make in excess of $50 million in this Warren plan.
And they would pay 2%, under the Warren plan, those people making $50 million a year or more, is that income or is that through investment income and everything? Is that the total income?
I think it's everything, but Colleen can.
They would pay a 2% tax. That does it. How much is that? 2%. What is 2% of $50 million? I can't do the math. I have a college degree and I can't do it. So is that a lot of money? Would that be a lot of money? I mean, they might scream about it, but would that be a lot of money? Would they feel the pinch?
I mean, I've never been a $50 million person, so I
Keep
don't.
working.
Yeah. A visiting assistant professor's salary is nowhere near a public radio's professional salary, so I think we're both in the same boat, Mike.
So under Elizabeth Warren's plan, the government would forgive up to $50,000 in student loan debt in households making less than $100,000 a year on a sliding scale up to those making $250,000 a year, and they would not forgive any debt for those making more than that. But that raises the question. Some types of education cost more than others, but the professions they lead to pay more than others. As a newly minted doctor, you've already talked about this. You can have tons of debt and you have great earnings potential. You'll probably be able to pay that off. Should that debt be forgiven or merely delayed until your income reaches a level where you can pay that off comfortably?
So I think.
How would you do it?
Sure. So I think we already have some pretty compelling mechanisms to pay back some of this debt that allows for debt that is both very large and very small. So income-based repayment, which I know Colleen's an expert in and can probably talk about more intelligently than I can, is one mechanism for that. So should we forgive the debts of people who are going to then be able to pay back the money? Would you, if you were a banker, forgive the debt of a small business if that small business could pay back the debt? Probably not. So there are different mechanisms we can use to make debt repayment easier, but it's not necessarily something that I would choose as the most efficient path forward.
We'll talk some more about that. We'll talk about fairness, and we'll talk about how maybe this isn't a good idea at all when we come back. By the way, 2% of $50 million is $1 million. Colleen Campbell's here from the Center for American Progress. Chris Marsicano from Davidson College. We're coming right back. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and the Carolina Core, a corridor stretching from the Triad to Fayetteville, including 4 sites of 7,200 acres, over 2.2 million workers, and more than 200 development sites. Details at nccarolinacore.com. Political turmoil in Puerto Rico after the resignation of Governor Ricardo Rosselló. The official who was set to take his place is now refusing to take the post. Whoever takes the helm faces a controversial bankruptcy, possibly stricter congressional oversight, and the threat of continued protests. The latest on what's happening and what's ahead for the island of Puerto Rico, coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock with Joshua Johnson and his guests on 1A. And we will continue to talk about college debt loan forgiveness and the cost of college in just a moment. Stay with us.
Join us for WFAE Eats, a culinary celebration where you're invited to enjoy samples from more than a dozen of Charlotte's food and beverage purveyors and vote for your favorites. WFAE Eats is Thursday, August 8th at the Charlotte Museum of History. Ticket information at WFAE.org. Proceeds to benefit WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about student loans and the increasingly high amount of money people are incurring in terms of debt to pay for their college educations. Should that be forgiven, as some of the presidential candidates have suggested, and the rising cost of college as well. Colleen Campbell is here. She's the director for post-secondary education at the Center for American Progress. Chris Marsicano is a visiting assistant professor of education studies at Davidson College. So what about Bernie Sanders' proposal? His proposal also includes provisions that would increase federal control over state-operated colleges and universities. I'm not sure that's even possible to do legally. Is there a substantial difference between what he's proposing in terms of controlling costs and paying off loans, debt forgiveness, as opposed to Senator Warren? Colleen.
Sure. So I think that the mechanisms are different, but both plans have an element of accountability that is sorely lacking in our system right now. So I had mentioned earlier that once a college gains access to federal financial aid, it's very difficult to kind of claw that back and to get the college out of the system. And so I think what we're seeing is a response to the current accountability system and the fact that there are a lot of colleges operating right now that are just not offering a good value to students.
Senator Warren's plan calls for eliminating federal money to for-profit colleges, and some say that would be devastating for those institutions. Do you agree, Chris?
Yes, it would absolutely be devastating to those institutions. Most of the profits, most of the revenues from those institutions do come from federal aid.
And when we talk about for-profit colleges, what are we talking about?
Sure. So it's actually a pretty broad sector.
Would Charlotte School of Law?
Charlotte School of Law would have been one, but also a local cosmetology school or a local auto tech shop, where a family-owned business where they teach students how to be mechanics or barbers or what have you. That would also fall into that category. So I think it's really important to note that it's a very broad and very diverse sector, but mostly when we're talking about reducing federal investment in for-profit institutions, we're talking about places like the University of Phoenix or DeVry University.
How would the prospect of a free college tuition to a public university impact private universities and college, Colleen?
I think that it would make it very challenging for those schools to recruit students. So, especially smaller private institutions that are not kind of the Harvards and Yales of the world that we typically think about would really face a challenge in recruiting the students and would likely shut down. A lot of them would have a lot of trouble operating.
And what same thing would happen to historically black colleges?
Right. So when we're talking about private institutions, let's make it very clear. These are not profit-seeking institutions. So these are places like Johnson C. Smith, Queen's University, or Catawba College. That's sort of the kind of institution.
Where does Davidson fall into that?
So I think Davidson would probably be fine. We have a pretty large endowment.
But you're private.
We are a private institution. We have a large endowment. We've got pretty substantial financial aid programs for students, and I think the small class size and I would like to think the quality of the faculty would make students want to come to Davidson regardless of whether they had to pay a relatively small amount.
If we forgive student loan debt, as Bernie Sanders would like to do, and I believe Elizabeth Warren wants to do it as well, there's $1.6 trillion of it sitting out there right now, more to come. Is some sort of means testing the only fair way to do this? You just can't say blanketly that we're wiping all of this out. Can you? I mean, for somebody who's making a lot of money as a stockbroker who went to college and incurred a bunch of debt and he's making $1 trillion a year, are we going to forgive his debt as just as we're going to forgive somebody's debt who's making $30,000 a year?
I think it's fair to say that the debt forgiveness plans vary from the very complicated, and I think Senator Harris's plan, to the more blanket, let's give it to everybody, which I think is closer to Senator Sanders' plan. So Senator Harris announced a plan of debt forgiveness where you have to be a Pell Grant recipient, which means you have to be a a low-income student who has graduated, started a business in an underprivileged community, and that business has continued for 3 years. So it's a very complicated plan that's very focused.
I mean, when you talk about this, does fairness enter the equation? Because suppose I'm the guy who just finished paying off $80,000 in college debt, or I'm at the tail end of paying that off, and suddenly, tomorrow, next year, you're forgiving debt. Well, what about me? Seriously.
Sure, I think that has absolutely factored into some of these conversations, but and it's also, folks who worked through school and opted to try to not take on student loan debt, and maybe delayed their graduation and all kinds of things. There's, the element of fairness is talked about for them too. I think the way that folks on the left usually frame this is that, we've had systems in place in the past where, we roll out a big forgiveness plan and, folks who have paid off their debt or, not received that benefit in the past are happy for the societal benefits of that going forward. I think that on the individual level, that might break down a little bit, but that's typically where those conversations are.
Politically, it's very attractive to say we're going to give you free tuition and we're going to forgive your college debt. If somebody wants to forgive my mortgage, I'll take it right now, no questions asked. But it just seems to me that there's a question of responsibility here.
Sure.
If you're smart enough to go to college, you're smart enough, I would think, to be able to figure out how much debt you want to incur and how long it will take to pay it back after you get out of school. And if you're going for an English degree or versus a medical degree, how much you're likely to make in the future given what your job prospects are and what those jobs pay. So don't you have to shoulder some responsibility for how much debt you are willing to incur given your prospect for being able to pay it back in the future? And if you miscalculate it, isn't that on you?
Well, again, to be very clear, most people who take on debt are able to pay back that debt. As Colleen said earlier, the default rate is
about 10%.
About 10%. So we're talking about 90% of people paying back their debt.
Well, it's 10% among African Americans.
10% among African Americans. What is it, 9 million total out of 45?
There are about 9 million people in default, and actually over longer period of time. So typically the shorter term, like within 3 years of leaving school, the default rate is around 10-11%. But over a 12-year period, the default rate is actually a little over 20%. So we do have a pretty significant number of folks defaulting on their debt, and especially people of color and African American folks in particular. So I think that that's, talking about fairness, that's where some of these arguments get a little bit more complicated, is that, I think that the senators that are running for president right now are very much interested in mitigating the differential impacts of debt by race, and they can't do a race-based policy. And so we're looking for ways that would alleviate the debt burdens of people of color. And in order to do that for the middle-class African Americans, you have to go a little bit further up the income spectrum.
So would any of the plans put forward by any of the presidential candidates, would the plan put forward by, and we haven't really talked about it, but the Center for American Progress has put together some suggestions on how some of this might be accomplished. Do they include paying off the debt or forgiving the debt of people who did not, for one reason or another, finish college, but they still have that loan to pay back? That would be forgiven for them as well?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that, and I do a lot of work on non-completers and borrowers who default on their loans, and they really are the people who are not getting that $1 million benefit of getting a bachelor's degree. They're hurt by their experiences in higher education, unfortunately. And so In terms of priorities, I think that it's really important that we consider the people who did not benefit from their college education in our debt forgiveness conversations. We put out a paper that has a variety of ways of tackling this, and as opposed to universal forgiveness or complete forgiveness for everyone. One of the things we talk about is forgiving debt up to a certain amount, so $5,000, $10,000 across the board, which would provide some relief to the people farther up the income spectrum, but really would do so much to alleviate the burdens of those people who didn't finish college.
Chris believes, I don't think I'm putting words in your mouth, and I think also the Center for American Progress, their report states, or in some form of this, that the biggest beneficiaries of free college would be the people who do not receive financial aid at prestigious schools, namely middle class and upper class Americans. They would be the biggest beneficiaries, not the people that you would normally think of. Do you agree with that? Is that true?
I think in broad strokes, yes, in that the people that group of people you just mentioned, upper middle class, wealthier Americans, don't have the same sort of non-merit based financial aid benefits that low-income students have. So it would subsidize people that can already afford to pay for college. So in that way, they're a big beneficiary. But it's also very important to note the free college would be very, very helpful to low-income people as well. It's just that there are already mechanisms in place that could be expanded or could be applied to more people at a lower cost than free college that would also help low-income people.
And I believe that your report at the Center for American Progress confirms that. Is that right?
Yeah, and we think about this as if we take a more targeted approach to debt-free education. And so, we would provide free tuition and fees, including living expenses, which is a really important factor for low-income students and especially adults who are enrolling in higher education. If they make less than 150% of the federal poverty level, they would pay nothing. And then once you start to make more than that, we start to kind of increase the cost that you bear as your income increases. But the way that we frame it is that no family would pay more than 20% of their income to enroll in a public college. And so that has a little bit of an impact of price controls on it, where those higher income families have some certainty and expectation of what they should be spending, but also the colleges know that they have to keep their costs under that amount.
So there's a skirmish going on within the Democratic Party between the centrist Democrats and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and the same is probably true on the Republican side when you come right down to it. But right now they're having this argument about how far to go to the left. Third Way, which is the flagship policy organization for centrist Democrats, agrees with the two of you on who will benefit most from college education. They warn that free college could increase inequality, and they call free college a regressive scandal because they say little money would flow to the genuinely neediest families or to independent students paying for college on their own, but to households where they earn over $120,000 a year. The idea of debt forgiveness and free college tuition plays well on the campaign trail for a lot of people, particularly to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who want to tax the 1% to pay for it. But if those in favor understood the impact this might have on low-income people, would most of the 60% of the voters who favor this be in favor of it?
I think that when folks think about policy, they typically think first of how is it going to impact my bottom line. And even though someone making $120,000 a year or family taking home that much may not think of themselves as upper middle class or wealthy, unfortunately, the income distribution of this country means that they are really in the top percentile of earners. And so I think that, folks tend to think a little bit about how their finances will be impacted, and this is what we get out of campaigns often, right? We want them to have broad appeal, especially to the electorate. And I think that Democrats have been really accused in the past of negotiating with themselves before releasing a plan. And so it's kind of nice to see these big, bold proposals coming out of candidates when in the past we might not have seen something so bold.
I think it's also important to note that there are a lot of private HBCUs, private MSIs, which would be a minority serving institution, that do a great job of educating first-generation students, students of color. They would not be recipients of any sort of federal, massive federal aid on the scale of free college under these plans.
In the states like Tennessee and Georgia and others where free college tuition is available for citizens of those states, how's it working? Was there any hue and cry by people who have to end up paying for it, the taxpayers?
Sure. So Tennessee's a really great example, a really interesting example, because it was passed, Tennessee Promise was passed by a Republican governor in a Republican-led legislature, and it is universally popular. So it is a very big-time policy that seems to be working, and it's also pretty financially solvent because the funding mechanism for it is the lottery funds, and even in times of recession, people still buy lottery tickets. They've also built an endowment from the lottery fund, so it can work in perpetuity.
So the Center for American Progress has done this analysis of how to deal with student loan debt and offers 6 options for consideration. 1, forgive all student loans. 2, forgive up to a set dollar amount for all borrowers, which is the Sanders and Warren approach. 3, forgive debt held by former Pell Grant recipients. 4, reform repayment options to tackle excessive interest growth and quicker paths to forgiveness. 5, change repayment options to provide more regular forgiveness. And 6, end all student loan refinancing, or provide student loan refinancing, I should say. Have the candidates talked about these approaches, and which of those approaches would you recommend, since you're putting 6 out there, Colleen?
Well, the intention of putting 6 out there is to allow people to kind of weigh the benefits and drawbacks of each of those options. And also, I think that it's important from our perspective to provide a kind of a menu of spending options. So, obviously forgiving all student loan debt is very, very expensive, but if you wanted to kind of limit the spending that you're doing on these plans, opting for something like some of the repayment plan reformation might be a better option for you. I think that what we're seeing is that, I would be surprised actually if from Senator Harris this Pell Grant plan is all we see from her. Yeah. But I think that we'll probably see some more moderate proposals picking up on the refinancing aspects or the limited dollar amount debt relief.
Colleen Campbell's Director for Post-Secondary Education at the Center for American Progress. Chris Marsicano, Visiting Assistant Professor of Education Studies at Davidson College. Thank you both.
Charlotte,